Thank you to One Invest for giving us the opportunity to share some insights with all our attendees this afternoon. Before I hand over to Ari and Yaz, I thought it would be worthwhile to just give you a definition of what we think of when we think about thematic investing. When I joined the investment industry, we invested most of our clients' assets locally in South Africa, very little offshore, and we mainly had access to active managers. But the industry has come a long way over the last 20 years or so. We can now invest a lot more internationally. And when we look at investing, we also get the opportunity to have a much bigger toolkit. So we would decide whether we want to invest in active strategies, passive strategies, smart beta or thematic themes. Now, if you Google thematic investing, you'll see that there are various definitions. The definition I like best is one that makes sense to me. When we invest in thematic themes, what we're basically looking for as investment managers is we're looking for opportunities or themes that we believe are going to play out in the future. So rather than being backward looking, we're future looking. And then we try and determine which companies or industries are likely to take advantage of those themes and do well. So there are two things that you need to consider if you're looking at putting thematic investments into your portfolio. The first is that they should be long-term in nature. So it's a long-term trend as opposed to a short-term fad. And the second thing is the reason why you would include it. Is it going to add to your clients' portfolios? In other words, is there going to be a capital gain, or is the portfolio going to appreciate from it? And one of the things we look at to determine that is it another extra opportunity? Does it add to diversification in your portfolio? But I'm now going to hand over to our two speakers. Welcome. I think we're going to start off with Ari. If you could maybe share your insights, and then we'll do some questions afterwards. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Flabella. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you. So I would like to spend the next sort of 5 to 10 minutes to go through the thematic capabilities and how we approach thematics here at S&P Dow Jones Indices. And I was going to start with how we define a thematic strategy, Flabella, which you have kindly already sort of pointed out. And I think I totally agree. There's no consensus out there, and it may vary from institution to institution, be it financial, academic, or the media. And as you pointed out, more recently, it's thought of as exposures to long-term structural shifts that are taking place, be it social, technological, political, or even environmental. Now, but if we consider a broad catch-all definition, a thematic strategy is simply designed to deliver a targeted investment exposure. Now, by that definition, we here at S&P Dow Jones Indices have been involved in thematics since 1999, since with the launch of the Dow Jones Internet Composite Index. And over the years, we've been launching various indices, providing exposures to various themes and sectors, and we continue to do so. I've also included here our involvement in ESG indices, and which coincidentally also dates back to 1999 with the launch of the Dow Jones Sustainability Indices. Now, I guess this is an area which is debatable with respect to the context of thematics. And we do see a link here between ESG and thematics in some instances. For example, where you have instances where clients who align their portfolios towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, for example. So there's 17 of them. Now, we are very active in this area. It's an area that is hugely popular. And you could argue some of these areas provide exposures to certain themes or certain exposures which are aligned with sort of policies that are in place globally, for example, the Paris-aligned indices and the climate transition indices. Now, these two areas, ESG and thematics alongside factors are strategic areas of focus here at S&P Dow Jones Indices, and we continue to invest our resources and build upon our capabilities. And if we look at our book of work and the pipeline we've seen, particularly over the 18 months, is heavily skewed, particularly here in Europe, heavily skewed towards ESG and thematics. Now, I've given you a glimpse of some of the indices that we have built along the way. And I guess the next question is, how do you bucket them? So what we've done is we've identified 4 main areas, which are commonly acknowledged in the industry as areas that are seeing structural growth. And, these are innovative technology. Now, these are technology that enhances the human evolution. Now, examples would be robotics, for example. Then we've got environment and real assets. Now, this is a relatively broad area. Now, this is linked to human activities that affect the environment, now economic development, natural resources, and ESG areas that attract societal awareness. Third, we've got society and demographics. Now, these are themes that capture essentially the changes that are happening in a society and the way we live. Now, this could be consumption-related themes, for example, luxury, or religious-related themes, for example, Catholic values or Sharia indices. Now, the 4th pillar is health and wellness. This is self-explanatory, and these are sort of areas that enhance the well-being, health and well-being of the society. So, for example, you could have digital health, wearables. These are different exposures that you could gain in this area. We've got a 5th pillar here, which is multi-theme. Now, this is where when a particular theme spans across multiple different areas, and this could be a broad ESG index, or it could even be, for example, a new economies composite, which spans across multiple themes. Now, this is the way we view it, and clients of ours may view things differently. So there are other taxonomies out there. I mentioned earlier the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We increasingly see that clients align their portfolios towards these goals. So there are different ways we could even map our indices to these different taxonomies as well.
Would you classify ESG and multi-style as a thematic or separate branch of investing?
So it's an interesting question. And I think when we talk about ESG, we have multiple flavors of ESG. Now, we have exclusion-based ESG indices, for example, the S&P 500 ESG. Now, I wouldn't consider that really thematics. But then we have, as I mentioned, other flavors, climate-related ESG indices, for example, the carbon efficient, Paris-aligned indices. Now, this, I guess, is getting closer to the line of thematics. You're trying to gain a certain exposure. But you do have very specific theme-based ESG concepts as well. Clean energy, for example, is an ESG-related theme. So I mentioned earlier about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. You have various goals there that relate to water scarcity, clean energy, infrastructure, biodiversity. So that the various aspects there which are very tied and related to ESG, where you'd consider those definitely thematics. Now, with respect to multi-style, I'm assuming you're referring to multi-factor indices.
Yes, sorry, multi-factor.
In that respect. So now, if I think what a multi-style or multi-factor index is essentially to deliver a diversified exposure to multiple factors, for example, quality, value, momentum. And what that does is essentially gives you a broad, diversified exposure with the lower risk. And I think for me, this probably is less so of a thematic. If I think of a thematic and how it fits, and you go back to its definition and how it fits in a portfolio, it could act as a diversifier to a core portfolio, whereas the multi-factor itself is the diversified exposure. So I think that's a bit debatable, but I'll be keen to hear what Yas thinks about it with his expertise.
Yes, should I give you an opportunity to respond to that?
I'd actually agree with a lot of what Ari was saying. I mean, you basically have to think about it as when you think about multi-factor investing, it's really about capturing risk premium embedded, and there are decades of academic and empirical support. So it's very different from the forward-looking expectations of thematics. So we'd argue that, for example, multi-factor might be more part of your SAA design, whereas thematics is kind of a shorter-term horizon. On the ESG intersection with thematics, I think Ari's absolutely right. When you kind of go from, it's actually very, very broad, and that investors are actually looking at incorporating ESG across their entire portfolio. But absolutely, it's linked to thematics in the context of environmental, in terms of social, in terms of the UN SDGs. And a lot of themes that are actually gaining a lot of popularity are actually in the ESG space. Ari mentioned climate change solutions, for example. So I think I'd actually agree with a lot of what you said.
Okay, thank you. For our South African investors, we've also had a couple of questions. So ESG, the E stands for environmental, S for social, and G for governance. And in international portfolios, there are a lot more opportunities. So because the investment landscape is so much larger, you can actually exclude investments into things that do not have ESG factors. In South Africa, our universe is fairly small. So if you were only trying to identify investments using those factors, you might not have sufficient choice. So I think maybe one of the things that we look at Momentum Investment Consulting, when we put portfolios together, we also do subscribe to the United Nations Principles of Responsible Investing, and we look at the ESG factors as well. I think one of the things that we probably need to look at when you look at investments, it's not only about having access to those and diversifying, but when we then measure it, should we be measuring the social and environmental impact beside the actual fund return? Ari, do you think you need to measure both?
So your question is specific to social or the individual pillars measurement?
Correct. So when some investment managers come back, they say, well, the fund hasn't done well, but
right.
We have invested in these ESG factors, so we're doing what we're supposed to be doing from a diversification perspective. Now, I would argue that you need to actually measure the social or environmental impact in the different pillars, as well as the fund's return. Both are important. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would definitely agree to that, and I think there's another aspect to it. I mentioned about earlier thousands of data points rolling up into a single ESG scores, and it's really how you go about employing. Let's say we're talking about gaining a specific exposure to an ESG tilt or some sort, and we need to determine. This. I guess this is where you separate between a sort of a tilt exposure versus a more thematic specific exposure to a certain area, for example, socially, right? So now coming back to my earlier point, when you roll up all the data points to a single score, you have the impact of averaging that is occurring across all the different data points, and you need to find a way of selecting by using some sort of metrics, and you do have certain instances where a company may score high on a couple of pillars but on lower on another, but the averaging effect may lead to a higher score. But so on an overall basis, you can assess a company with respect to its scores and how it's performing, and I guess performance is a different, how it performs overall is a different question altogether.
Yeah.
But if you're looking specifically to certain pillars, then I guess you can drill down and select sort of companies that score highly against these pillars, and you hope that these will play out over the long term.
Yes, I'd like to hand over to you now and give you an opportunity to talk us through your styles and how you think about thematic investing.
Great. Well, thank you, Flabella, and thank you to everyone for inviting us here and giving us this opportunity to share our insights on thematic investing. I think in this section, what I'll do is I'll just offer some initial thoughts on two key aspects of the topic. One is where the demand for thematic stems from, and also where might it fit in within a portfolio. And then secondly, to share some thoughts about about our approach to building thematic exposures. And you'll see some similarities with Ari's work, but obviously we come to the problem from an active perspective. So it'll be interesting to contrast the kind of similarities and the differences. So first of all, what is driving the growth of thematics? I think we've seen an increased interest from clients in thematic investing. I mean, that's a truism. They are looking for more focused exposures to particular trends. In the introduction, Flabella mentioned that these can be economic, demographic, or environmental nature, but really there's essentially you're capitalizing on some element of growth, and that's kind of the core need for an investor is what you're actually allocating to here is something that you believe is a driver of growth and therefore return, and also provides diversification across your portfolio. But Ari mentioned one point which actually is also important, which is sometimes thematics is simply allowing clients to align their investments with their values or convictions. Now, related to this is the whole issue we discussed around values or convictions, and that is an important driver in the growth of thematic investing, which is a shift amongst end clients to being able to allocate capital in a manner that is less focused on traditional geographic or sectoral exposures. And that is particularly true for the younger generations. So in surveys, it's often been shown that they have a much greater predisposition to thematic investing than the market overall. And part of that is actually a values alignment. So now if I take a step back and think about us in terms of our approach in thematic investing, in the quantitative solutions team at JP Morgan Asset Management, we've spent a significant amount of time over the past 3 to 4 years considering how best to meet this increasing demand from clients for thematic strategies. And it's resulted in the launch of a number of thematic strategies covering a range of topics from disruptive technologies. I think when we actually think about the 3 broad areas, disruptive technologies, people and demographics, and sustainability. And these are kind of similar to the very broad brush themes that Ari mentioned before and Flabella included when she first talked about thematics. So as an asset manager, I'd say our value proposition is really focused on the combination of a few things. One is leveraging powerful technology, AI capabilities, and you'll see some similarities but some differences from what Ari spoke about, but also leveraging fundamental insights that come through the broad company research platform, basically our active equity analysts. And so kind of being able to bring both to the creation of and management of thematic investing, we believe is actually a very powerful proposition. I'll start by talking a little bit about our AI engine, which we refer to as ThemeBot. So this is an AI technology that underpins the data element of the process. So ultimately, on the surface, it's actually similar to some of the things Ari mentioned, but I will go into a little bit more detail around how it works, so you can see the differences, because, I mean, he actually gave a decent amount of information there as well, which is good. So ultimately, it's also a natural language processing engine, and clearly it provides a very highly scalable and customizable framework for thematic investing. But some of the unique things that using a tool like this is brings to the table that potentially another traditional active manager might miss is, so ThemeBot is able to uncover smaller cap pure plays, for example, that might not be in the coverage universe of a traditional analyst team. I'd also argue that it can think outside the box to a certain extent, where sometimes we find it suggesting names that are not obvious at first glance, but once the analysts then do a little bit more research on the, and actually one I think one very important point of artificial intelligence is that often AI tools are black boxes. And so we've built this to very much be something an analyst can interact with. And so that so what happens is that if you get something that seems a little bit orthogonal, the analyst looks at it, can actually see the data that the AI engine throws out as saying, this is why I've decided that this stock is relevant, and then determine whether it is indeed the case or not. And that's actually we found it to be quite valuable, an additive to an analyst's toolkit. Naturally, of course, using a tool like this improves time to market, as elements of theme creation that traditionally would have been done manually can now be replaced with the power of AI and machine learning. But if I just spend a moment about how ThemeBot works. So ultimately, it ranks stocks on two metrics. So the first metric we refer to as textual relevance, and the other one is revenue relevance. So that was really everything I had to say.
Great. Thank you very much. So I guess my question for you is, does valuation matter in thematic funds? In other words, if you've had a massive rally in a particular sub-theme, should you downweight it towards a cheaper theme, or do you think you just let it run?
Interestingly, one area of focus at that point that we've been working on is actually developing a framework around return expectations around the theme. So by adapting, we have at JP Morgan the long-term capital markets assumptions framework that and adapting that to kind of apply to thematic investing. So you kind of bring the macroeconomic work of our strategists with the bottom-up work of our sector analysts. Because absolutely, a theme can be expensive. And so you do want to actually monitor. And actually, this is, funnily enough, one area where you can actually bring multi-factor and thematics together, where you actually also look at the multi-factor how do all the different themes look like from a factor lens, and is it expensive relative to where it's been? Now, they'll generally have look expensive relative to the broader market. That's not necessarily an issue, but the question is it might look expensive relative to itself or relative to other measures. You kind of want to make sure that you have appropriate measures to look at themes, because just like any other asset, it will go through cycles.
In South Africa, even though thematic investing is fairly new in comparison to some of the offshore providers, it is something that's been in existence for some time now. And when we put together portfolios for clients, we do include these factors and look at them firstly from a strategic asset allocation perspective. So where do we think we need to be invested for the long term? But there, as Yaz correctly said, when you find opportunities in the short term, there's an opportunity to also tactically tilt your portfolio towards those. Since this is a One Invest session, the One Invest S&P 500 Infotech a fund which focuses in the US was launched about 3 years ago. It is a first generation thematic type of fund. Obviously, since then, it's evolved, and we're now looking at more specific sub-themes, things like clean energy. And I think whatever the strategy is that you're using, you should always be looking at how the portfolio as a whole has performed. So risk is important. You can't not consider risk in the portfolio. And I guess you'd also want to make sure that after investment fees, you're still outperforming, regardless of how you're constructing portfolios for clients. I hope that you can all see that investing has become more complicated, not less. And increased toolkit just means we have so much more that we need to analyze. So there's so many more opportunities, and with it comes risk. But I think the most important thing, thanks to both our speakers for sharing your insights, I think the most important thing is about values. So when you're asking an asset manager to put together a portfolio for you, does it tie in with your values and what you're trying to achieve as an outcome? And thank you to One Invest for giving us the opportunity to look into this in a little bit more detail. Thank you both, Ari and Yaz.